Thank you again for joining us for Bonds of War, How Civil War Financial Agents Sold the World on the Union. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to remind those of us joining in person to please silence your cell phones. David K. Thomson is Assistant Professor of History at Sacred Heart University. He is a historian of the 19th century United States with a special focus on the history of capitalism in the Civil War era. Thomson received his PhD from the University of Georgia and joined the faculty of Sacred Heart in the fall of 2016. He teaches both halves of the United States History Survey as well as electives on the American Civil War, Reconstruction, American capitalism, and United States foreign policy. I'll return to moderate questions after the presentation as time permits. If you have a question, please come to the microphones at the front of the room, or if you're joining us virtually, drop them in the chat. Please join me in welcoming my friend, Dave Thomson.
Thank you, Patrick, for that very kind introduction. And thank you all for making it out tonight. I was telling Patrick that you all really rolled out the warm weather for me coming from Connecticut. I flew in this morning and it's actually colder here than it is in Connecticut. So thank you for that. A little bit of that taste of winter. I'm going to take my watch off so that I can be very mindful of the time. If I'm staring at it, looking back up at me, it's a little bit easier. And so I'm going to be speaking tonight, obviously, on my new book, Bonds of War. And I always like to start with this image, because when I look at this image, I actually see dollar signs, right? I see all the costs of war. You see cannonballs, personnel, tents, there are horses in there if you look close enough, ships and more. All of this costs money. The Civil War cost the United States government $3.2 billion in the 1860s. I always like to say this is a really important topic, and obviously I'm a bit biased because I wrote a book on it, but I say it's not just me who thinks that. I say that if you actually look at the newspapers from the time period, right next to all the battlefield reports are reports about the financial performance, the value of a bond, what they're selling for, the various machinations in Congress in terms of trying to put forward new bills to authorize to fund the war. So it's not just me who thinks this is something that's important. Folks during the war did as well. And I should be very clear that I'm talking about how the U.S. is actually going to fund the war tonight. In terms of the Confederacy, I'm happy to kind of give you the broad strokes in the Q&A if anybody's got that question. But I'm just talking, and the book just talks about how the federal government actually finances a war that, by the way, in today's money is costing you on the order of $6.7 trillion. So this is a very, very pricey war. About 75% of this war is going to be funded through the sale of bonds and other similar financial instruments, essentially IOUs on the future. So the federal government, about 75% of that funding is going to be put forward through 32 different financial instruments. We can all take a deep breath in the room and online. I'm not going to talk about 32 different types of bonds with you tonight. I'm going to talk about 2 of them, if that's okay. But it's a really, really interesting story that I think discusses at length, as it says here, the distinctive role of Union bonds, U.S. debt during the war, not only for global finance, and we'll talk about the global picture in all of this, but also 19th century state development here at home. This endeavor is going to be led by a man named Jay Cooke. I'll get into him in a little bit more detail. He has a very colorful history. And tonight, it's a happy story. It gets a lot sadder as we move on into the 1870s. But the people that bought this debt, it's worth noting, are not just wealthy investors. These are going to be people that cross gender boundaries, racial boundaries, and socioeconomic boundaries as well. That this is truly, I would argue, the first war that we see as kind of one that's sold to the masses. We talk about World War I and World War II bonds that are often sold to the masses, and they're catered to that large crowd. The Civil War predates that, and I'll kind of bring it full circle by the end here. But crucially, what I'm looking at with this work is how do they sell those bonds? How do they market those bonds, right? This is a story about people. How do you convince a nation to buy something that they don't really know what it is, frankly, a large chunk of them? You have to convince them that this is something that not only they should buy because it might benefit them materially, but that it's good for the cause of the country. When they're hearing kind of conflicting terms around things like profiteering, people, selling the government bad rifles, shoddy uniforms, you need to convince someone that it's okay to make a profit on the war, in essence, by purchasing a bond, right? They have to kind of separate, and that's the task before Jay Cooke here at the beginning of the war. But we have to go through a bit of rough waters before we can actually get to Cooke. I always like to include at least a couple of quotes, and I can't resist this one from a Harper's Weekly from May of 1863, just after the Battle of Chancellorsville, because they could not be further off from the truth, right? There are no shortage of Civil War books, right? It's a very vibrant market, but there are very few on Civil War finance, and I think that's a shame. And so I hope tonight to be able to rectify that a little bit here for you all. This is one of the bonds from the war. There are very few surviving US bonds from the Civil War because they're redeemed, right? And once they're redeemed, the Treasury Department destroys them. And we have very detailed records of the Treasury Department destroying these bonds. But we do have a couple that have survived that are within private hands, and I've gotten at least the images here. This is one of them from 1861. And the coloring is actually what they are. They're beautiful colors when you actually look at them. So from a kind of material culture standpoint, they're just something that's absolutely stunning. Okay, so start of the war. Start of the war starts with this guy, Salmon P. Chase, Secretary of the Treasury. No financial experience whatsoever. Chase is a lawyer. Chase is a lawyer, no offense to lawyers in the room. Chase is a lawyer, fugitive slaves, and representing them has become kind of his stock and trade as we approach the war. He's brought into the cabinet by Lincoln, right? Team of rivals bringing in these potential political adversaries so that he keep an eye on them. But Chase does not have a financial background. Chase is going to try to fund this war, at least at the beginning, based on how previous wars have been funded by the US federal government. And that is by reaching out to bankers in northern cities, New York principally, but also Boston, Philadelphia, and to a lesser degree, Washington, DC, just down the road. It doesn't go well, in short. Chase does not have the financial acumen. He does not have the patience for dealing with some of these bankers. He goes to New York, and when he does not receive kind of a rousing reception, when he asks them for money, and to be clear, this isn't just a gift. They are purchasing bonds that have already been put on the market. He threatens that he'll print so much money that breakfast will cost $1,000, right? That doesn't assuage their concerns that this guy actually knows what he's doing. They will follow him back to DC on multiple occasions. They will meet with the president and say, you have a guy running the Treasury who has no idea what he's doing, Mr. President. And by the end of 1861, financially speaking, the federal government's in rough shape. Chase put forward estimates of how much the war might cost. He's woefully off. I don't know if we can fully kind of blame him for that. He's operating under the assumption this is going to be a brief war, perhaps a 90 days war, and then he needs to significantly adjust his calculus. But by the end of the war, militarily, things aren't going well for the North, especially in the Eastern theater. And financially, what we see is a suspension of specie payment in this country, meaning if you had bills, you could not go to your bank and turn them in and get gold coin back in exchange or silver. So we have suspension of specie, the economy effectively grinds to a halt, and Chase is a bit at his wit end. Congress will step in briefly. They've been talking about this for quite a while, and they finally get around to passing the Legal Tender Act in the spring of 1862. This creates a new federal currency, a national currency, the greenback. This is a greenback bill here, a $5 bill. It's $150 million that get put in circulation. But kind of a lesser known component of this Legal Tender Act is a $600 million bond issue, which is the largest the federal government has tried to place on the market in the 19th century. So how do you sell this thing? Well, into this world comes this man, Jay Cooke, because he's going to present a radically different vision of how you might actually sell these bonds. Cooke is a banker from Philadelphia. So he's not from New York, right? He's not on Wall Street. He is a little known banker, I would say. He has opened his new bank in 1859, 2 years before the war. Prior, he had worked at a very prominent Philadelphia bank. And he decides that he wants to present to Chase, a fellow Ohioan, although they don't really know each other. He wants to present an alternative. He says, how about we try to sell these things to the people? Instead of just selling them to wealthy investors or to banks who then sell it to some of their clients, why don't we actually try to go to the masses? Now, Cooke does not invent this idea, right? This is something that has happened before, particularly in Europe. The French did it quite effectively in the 1850s. So did the Austrians. Cooke reads a lot, particularly on international reports when it comes to finance. And so he thinks there is a possibility here to do this in the United States. All he really needs is for Chase to give him the go-ahead. Cooke is going to benefit from having his brother in Washington. His brother, named Henry, is a newspaper editor back in Ohio. He moves to Washington, D.C. He's going to run the Washington operation of this bond drive that will emerge. He is going to be the person that is going to be going into every office on Capitol Hill. He actually will host a fairly well-known kind of happy hour at a hotel in DC. So drinks were on him, and there was an expectation that maybe you might help him or pass that legislation so that his brother's bank could do fairly well. And so Henry is actually the one that kind of brokers the deal to get Jay Cooke the exclusive agency to sell these bonds. All right, so you're going to let this guy, and the image on the left, we believe, is from the Civil War. So that's roughly what Cooke looks like during the war. If we know Cooke at all, by the way, I alluded to it before, you might know of him because he's kind of the guy who brings down the country in the Panic of 1873. Railroad speculation is going to take him out and he loses everything in 1873. But in the 1860s, this is a guy who is going to be fairly well known and a relative hero here in the United States. Okay, so how do we sell these bonds to the masses, right? This hasn't been done before in the United States. As I said, Cooke has a little bit of a blueprint here. He's going to rely heavily on marketing, and he's going to enlist ultimately thousands of people that are effectively traveling salesmen who are going to work on his behalf. All right, so between marketing, using newspapers, and using these traveling salesmen who get a cut, right? They get part of Cooke's commission as the overall agent. It's not a lot of money, by the way. All right, it's 3/8 is his cut, is his commission, and he gives an 1/8 to the traveling salesman, right? So he essentially gets 1/4%. And he has to pay for all of his marketing costs on his own. So all that costs have to be absorbed by Jay Cooke. Cooke is going to use this as his lens by which he can try to convince people. He is going to put articles in newspapers that are wholly fictional, but they're actually fantastic. He's going to have fictional Q&A back and forth with these farmers, right? And the farmer will say, I spend my day in the field. I know nothing of these big city folk and their financial instruments, right? And the whole thing's made up, right? We have letters to prove it in Philadelphia that Cooke wrote the script himself. He got feedback because some people thought it was too hokey at times. And he writes, oh no, dear farmer, right? You can personally buy a bond. It's very simple. It's a promise on the future. It's a good investment for you. You'll get your money back. It's safe and secure. I was interviewed last night by someone who was so inspired, they said, by purchasing my book that they went and bought a savings bond. And they said that on the website that, you know, the FAQs are essentially still there, right, from the Treasury explaining it. This is what Cooke is doing. The Treasury doesn't have that kind of FAQ option for you in the 1860s. He's got to explain to people what a bond is, right? Maybe they have some money and that's about it. They might have a savings account. They exist, but not everybody has them. So now you got to convince them to actually pony up some money and buy a bond. This is the bond issue that Cooke is going to be made the exclusive agent of, and this is the lone surviving bond. They're known as 520s at the time. They're put out in 1862, and they're called 520s because the federal government can call in the bond after 5 years, but the bond matures in 20 years. So the nickname was 520. It's a 6% interest on the bonds, which was a very favorable interest rate at the time in the 19th century, particularly for sovereign debt. All right, 6%. And these are the coupons. At the bottom, you can see that people would pull off, and then twice a year, you would turn in your coupons, May and November, to get your interest payment. There are other bonds that were considered registered bonds at the time, and those you had to document with the government if you were exchanging them with someone. But a coupon bond, you know, you could just have a very simple transaction with someone, and the government doesn't know that it's changing hands. They're just keeping track of the coupon sales. Cooke's going to run his entire operation from Philadelphia. He never moves to New York. He hates New York bankers. So his operation is in Philadelphia on South 3rd Street. He eventually hires a PR firm out of New York City in the second half of the war to write his PR copy for him. But at the beginning, it's him and one other guy, and they're just kind of holed up in his office. He occasionally will go down to Washington, D.C. To kind of consult with his brother and also the Secretary of the Treasury. These bonds are going to be sold in increments as low as $50 so that kind of the masses can afford them. That's still a lot of money in 1862. Your average individual is only pulling in a little over $300 a year. So a $50 bond is still a lot of money. They finance these bonds for people. So you can, for 10 simple, easy payments, you too can buy a $50 bond in 1862, right? So they're trying to make it so that it's easy for folks to purchase these bonds, right? You make them in small denominations, you go to them. That's what these traveling salesmen are for. They go to the hard to reach locales. These are not traveling salesmen based in cities, because in the cities, people can go to the banks who are all partnered with Cooke in some way, shape, or form. These are people who are reaching very remote areas to try and get kind of very rural Americans and even some folks in the Confederacy to purchase these bonds by the end of the war. This is a very standard ad that you would have seen at the time, looking at this 6% 520 loan. The other ad here is obviously not in English, it's in German, right? And that was another thing for Cooke. He said, you've got to reach people where English is not their first language. So there are bonds advertised in German that are going to be placed all over Pennsylvania. There are going to be Swedish advertisements for places like Wisconsin. And so Cooke gets it fundamentally, I think, at the end of the day, that if you're trying to truly reach the masses, you've got to really kind of put it all out there in terms of, and no idea is really a dumb idea. And it meets with wild success. The federal government can't keep up. They struggle to get the bonds out the door because people start to buy these things in such large numbers. They have to hire new people to help process the bond coupons. And that's what this image is getting at here. This is actually an instance where the Treasury is hiring some of its first female employees ever. These are women who are working at the Treasury Department who are processing these bond coupons. It actually becomes a source of a congressional investigation because allegations are made that the women are distracting at the Treasury to the male employees. I'm not making it up. And it's the source of like a multi-week congressional hearing that essentially the conclusion is actually they're not that distracting. They're actually quite proficient with their work. Maybe something else is going on, and these perhaps are some incompetent gentlemen, but the women are actually doing their job and doing it quite well. So one of the kind of big sources for my book, particularly when we talk about the domestic side, it doesn't look that impressive up there. It's bond ledgers. These are just detailed sales records of all the bonds sold by the federal government. These things still exist. These are ledgers that are housed in the National Archives. It's at the Satellite Branch in College Park, Maryland. And there are over 700 volumes, and each one is about 450 pages long. And as a historian, I really so fortunate to kind of nerd out. So I see that these exist and I put in a request to get them, and they come out to me and they're all in shrink wrap. I say, well, why are they in shrink wrap? And they say, well, when we moved to this facility in the late 1980s, everything got shrink wrapped if it was a volume. I said, so no one's looked at this since the 1980s? And they said, no. And so, my heart goes a flutter. And then I take the shrink wrap off, and there's these little locks on them, and they date to the 1880s. And I say, one, can we break these? And two, does that mean no one's looked at these since the 1880s? And they say, well, we think no one has. And so I got very excited because it's incredibly invaluable information. When we look at the different types of bonds, they're broken down by geographic area. You can run it against census data. So I did this in some instances. I mean, some deep homework, frankly, of looking at who these people are, because it gives you a fuller picture. And what it actually reveals is that when Cooke is talking about selling these bonds to the masses, it's not just a marketing ploy that doesn't pan out. It really does actually happen. When you actually look at some of these, you see these $50 bonds by, Prussian immigrants named Mary Hine, right? Her husband's a day laborer in Chicago. She is a seamstress. They buy a $50 bond, right? It gives just a little bit more kind of color and flavor to it when you actually kind of put a human to the story. It's not just basic numbers, that these are real people. And that they're scraping together, I can fully imagine in some instances, funds, right? Because when we look and we cross-reference it with things like occupation, and it says something like day laborer, they're not making a ton of money, right? There are plenty of professionals buying these bonds as well. They probably can financially afford it. So there's something going on here that convinces Cooke, that enables Cooke to convince these people, I should say, to actually purchase these bonds. Many, many immigrants are purchasing these bonds within the United States. Many, many women. Depending on the bond issue I was looking at, it was roughly a 50-50 split at times. This is massive financial investment by women. And oftentimes you see it as a point that they are listed as a separate line item, if you will, from a husband, right? That the husband bought $100, but they bought $50. There's a wonderful journal that I was reading in New York City at an archive, and a woman talks about how she essentially viewed these purchases as financial independence for the first time in her life, right? She made the decision, she did the research, she went and bought them. And she said no man told her what to do. And I just love reading that letter because I thought it was really interesting. This is obviously a modern map, so the borders don't really match up. But what I wanted to try to visualize for you all was where people come from who are purchasing bonds within the United States. So it's not perfect, right? So you can see Canada is not lit up. I know people from Canada bought bonds. I know they bought them in Canada. I don't have definitive proof a Canadian purchased it in this country. Do I think it happened? Sure. Am I erring on the side of caution? Yes. All right. But you can see that it's really a global investment, right? It's not just people from the United States. It's not just immigrants even from Europe. It's people from quite literally all over the globe that are purchasing these bonds during the war. And it's only going to become even more global after the war. Institutions buy these bonds as well. I should probably point that out. Universities, right? They've got some money. They got to put it somewhere. Oberlin, Columbia, Yale, Harvard. There are other universities that are listed in there. Historical societies and archives, they purchase these bonds. Actually, some of the ones that I was researching at purchased the bonds, so I could actually send them an email and be like, hey, just so you know, when I was there researching that topic, you actually purchased bonds. And one of them ended up in an exhibit for them because I thought that was an interesting kind of look at their history in the 19th century. So it's not just individuals. There are fascinating kind of loads of examples. There's peace societies. I came across one that they purchased a bond. They said that they couldn't actually provide funds directly to the war, but this was okay because it was kind of indirect. They didn't actually know where the money was going, so they just kind of viewed it like it was going towards uniforms or something like that, but not actually towards weapons of war. So it was justified. members of Congress, Abraham Lincoln, right? All sorts of socialites. Brooks Brothers Clothing Company purchases large quantity of these bonds. Probably if it's somebody that is semi-famous at this time, they may have bought a bond in the United States. It's millions of people. And Cooke is going to oversubscribe this loan, right? It's a $500 million loan. Before he shuts the books, it's already at 514 million. And it's a wild success. Not everybody's a fan of Cooke. I will point that out. Cooke is going to be investigated by Congress multiple times for favoritism. Typically, these are Democrat investigations, although some Republicans don't like him either. There are allegations that he is purchasing gifts for Chase. It comes out that he's actually managing Chase's money in New York City, and so they have to stop doing that because there's a perceived conflict of interest there. But Cooke comes through to the other side in all of this. I want to mention one more bond issue to you all. So there were 520s that I mentioned. There's another bond issue. It's $800 million. And they're called 730s. And just to make it confusing, they're called 730s because it's a 7.3% interest rate, right? So we're not even trying to be consistent here. But 730s are put out in 1864. Initially, they actually tried to sell these without Cooke as the agent, right? So they say, oh, people know what bonds are now. So you've kind of built out the infrastructure. People are just going to go and buy them. And they struggle. The first series of the loan, it takes 169 days. And so they come to Cooke and they say, will you please come back and sell these? And Cooke says, yeah, I will. And takes, fairly favorable terms for the government. And the government, as I said, it took 169 days for them to sell the first series. Cooke comes back, he sells the next series in only 52 days. So he's got a system, he's got a machine in place. And the 730 loan in particular is great for some of these traveling salesman reports. They were collected by Cooke and they still are housed in Philadelphia at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania to this day. And they're a treat, frankly. Because it gives you insight into these people who are reporting back to headquarters, if you want to look at it that way. And it reveals the disparate regions of America that they're actually getting to. So there's a man named Edward Sackett, who's an agent in Wisconsin, and he writes all these reports about selling bonds to groups of individuals in Wisconsin. He meets with great success selling them to a group of miners. He says he goes underground to convince them, right? He meets up with them in the mines, and that's how he convinces them to buy bonds. I'm sure there's a little bit of artistic liberty here, right? Or artistic license, but it makes for some great stories. These bonds, as I said, are sold around the country. In California, a brand new bank named Wells Fargo and Company is going to sell these bonds on behalf of the federal government, and I'm really through Cooke. Cooke is also going to have family sell these bonds. One of my other favorite stories is that Jay Cooke has a brother-in-law who is a traveling salesman for him, but he's a traveling salesman in Missouri, which is kind of ground zero for guerrilla warfare. Jay Cooke sent him there. And so I tend to think he doesn't maybe like his brother-in-law because he sends him, he's mugged, loses a whole bunch of money. He writes back and he's like, hey, Jay, can I come and work in the Philly office? Your sister lives in Philadelphia. I'd like to see her. And he says, no, you're doing the Lord's work in Missouri, so I'm going to keep you there. And he gets mugged again. So there's obviously a backstory to that in the family, but it's just really interesting to kind of see these relationships emerge with some of these traveling salesmen. He really comes to rely on some of them as really his correspondents in the field to give him a sense of the temperature, right? We need more people here. Publicity is not getting through because of this reason or that reason, right? These are his eyes and ears in local communities to try to help him sell these bonds outside of big cities. These are some of the 730 ledgers as well. Again, it looks like a list of names and numbers, but it tells a much larger story. And of course, because I'm here in Louisville, I had to have at least a couple of Louisville slides, right? I hope I'm saying that right. I was on the plane in today and the flight attendant said Louisville, and there was this audible groan. And I knew that was not right. So this is one image, and here's a second. And there's a few more, and I'm going to get them to the Thomson because they're all here in town. And so some of the names I'm sure are going to ring a bell. But it just astonishes me, frankly, kind of the scope of these sales. They're going to sell these bonds at night. Again, you have to meet the public where they are. So if you want to sell them to the masses, and some people work night shifts, right? You need to be where they are. So they create night offices in places like New York City. You either are coming off shift, you're going on shift. Free coffee and donuts. All you have to do is listen to a pitch about a bond. It's like someone selling you a timeshare, right? It's just, that's all it is. And it's not just New York that they do this in other cities as well. So there's always kind of this effort to try to reach other groups. Soldiers, of course, are a huge group as well, right? They want to get buy-in from those who are actually out there fighting in the war. One soldier, they use this quote again and again in some of their literature, says, if I fight hard enough, my bonds will be good. And that's a soldier from the Army of the Potomac. And it's a real quote. I was like, I think Cooke made this up. And then I actually found the letter. So it's a real quote. The 5th Kentucky Cavalry purchases $30,000 worth of these bonds. So there's another Kentucky connection for you. Many of these soldiers are going to purchase the bonds in large numbers. They're going to set up arrangements so that on payday, right, if a soldier gets paid, they're going to have somebody there who can also sell them a bond, right? And it's a secure way to get that money back home, if you will, right? They can make arrangements to get the bonds to your family. They're also going to sell these bonds in the Confederacy. I don't want to go so far as to say Confederates are purchasing these bonds, because maybe they're not, right? But people in the Confederacy are purchasing these bonds. Places like New Orleans become very large centers for the sale of bonds. And it leads to further rabbit holes. Just as an example, there was a woman named Julia Caudle, and it said that she was a washer in New Orleans, but she purchases thousands of dollars worth of these bonds. And long story short, going through some of the local newspapers, Julia Caudle runs a brothel. And so she's washing money, right? She's laundering money. So there's lots of different ways that you can actually invest and use in a creative way, right? I'm sure Cooke didn't want to publicize that, but that's just another one of these stories. And then Cooke will play a very important role after Lincoln is assassinated. That's the only time he goes to New York during the entire Civil War. And he says, I'm going to personally manage financial market, bond sales essentially in New York after Lincoln's assassination, because he doesn't want there to be a dip in the sale of bonds. He wants there to be kind of a financial stability at this moment of incredible instability in the nation. I want to spend just a couple minutes introducing you all to the international side of this, right? Because it's not just domestically that you're going to see these bond sales take off. Traditionally, London has been the financial capital of the world in the 19th century, and there was thoughts that you could actually sell these bonds in London, but the British are very reticent to buy these bonds. They have deep ties to the South, and at the beginning of the war, hedging their bets a little bit. So there are some sales of these bonds in London, but they're actually going to be sold in larger quantities elsewhere. This is actually a letter from a Dutch bank to a London partner saying that there's a huge market for these bonds, American debt in Amsterdam. So can you please make these bonds available in Amsterdam so that people can buy them? This is one London bank. We have a surviving ledger for it. This was in an archive in London. I got to look at it. And it's a bit cheating though, because George Peabody, the owner of the bank, is actually an American. So he's based in London, but he's American. But beyond that, it's really hard to sell these bonds. And this is George Peabody in London today. There's a statue of him in London. London sales don't really pan out. France, Paris, they don't really pan out. They're actually banned on the Paris Stock Exchange. You cannot purchase an American bond during the Civil War legally in Paris. And so what is ground zero for the financial market outside the US? It's actually the German states, right? Germany doesn't exist as a country yet, but the German states and Frankfurt specifically. This is one of my favorite images. it's a poster. So it's a photo of a poster, but it is of a New York banking firm, although they're German immigrants, Zellingmans, trying to sell bonds in Frankfurt. And Frankfurt is going to be successful for a couple of reasons, but the biggest one is because of kind of a shared faith network. You're going to have Jewish bankers in Frankfurt who have deep ties with some Jewish banks in the United States, and that's going to facilitate the transportation of these bonds. They physically transport them across the Atlantic Ocean, right? So there's lots of ads in newspapers if you're reading European newspapers at that time for like, my bond is missing. Here's the number. It was supposed to be on this ship. It was supposed to be here on this date. We don't know where it is. If you locate it, please let me know at this address. But Frankfurt's a really interesting kind of dynamic. It's a very active sovereign debt market at this time. The infrastructure in Frankfurt is such that American debt is going to sell quite well, and they have a huge cheerleader in the form of the American consulate in Frankfurt, a man named William Walton Murphy, who, for reasons still unknown to me to this day, was appointed the U.S. consul in Frankfurt. He's from Michigan. He has no kind of State Department experience whatsoever, but this guy is going to move heaven and earth to convince Frankfurt bankers to purchase these bonds. He's going to host them at his home. He's going to host what he calls Bundesschießens, which are shooting festivals out in the countryside, right? Listen to him give a speech and eat and drink your heart's content, and hey, maybe you buy a bond. All right, and it works, and it's remarkably successful. And we have newspaper reports back, articles in the New York Times talking about bonds being purchased in the German states, and that these purchases are being made by the masses, by working people, right? So again, it's getting to this idea of the masses purchasing these bonds. So even though Jay Cooke is not intimately involved with this, he doesn't want to focus on the international market. It's a source of actually concern for his brother, Henry, who travels to Europe and comes back and says, oh my God, people really want bonds over there. We need to get in on this. And he will later with railroads after the war. But during the war, it's not Cooke, but it's still this same idea that the masses are purchasing these bonds. And what limited evidence we have left from German banks, this is one bond of a German bank. Most of them are destroyed by the Nazis. If it's a Jewish bank, all the records are destroyed in the 20th century. But this is a Christian bank, so their records have survived. And the blue box up there, it says 6%, 1882 Amerikaner, and that's those 520 bonds. So, a little bit of detective work on my end and learning German and Dutch a bit has gone a long way to try to kind of flesh out the story here. By the end of the war, there's hundreds of millions of dollars of this debt held in the German states, held in the Netherlands as well. Estimates vary, but it's safe to say at least hundreds of millions of dollars are held abroad, and that's only going to increase after the Civil War. By 1870, 5 years after the war ends, half of the U.S. national debt is held abroad. And some people say this is a huge political liability during the period of Reconstruction. This can be a source of great concern for some. Others are less concerned. People like Cooke actually see it as a real asset, that it means the U.S. has really entered the stage as a truly kind of global financial player, and that they're going to be treated with respect. For time purposes, just a couple more slides I want to show you. This is actually a ledger of a Swiss bank. So probably not going to come as a shock to anybody who has any stereotype of the Swiss bank. They're very hard to get into to their records, but a few of them do let you in, and this is one. And again, it's purchasing of these bonds, and it actually will say in there that they're purchasing these bonds largely in places like Frankfurt. So it's Swiss banks purchasing the bonds in Frankfurt. So again, and for clients who stretch the spectrum, some of them are lawyers and architects, but some of the other clients that we were able to locate in some of these Swiss archives are kind of blue collar working class individuals. So it really spans that kind of wide net. And I think it's here. This is just another bank in Frankfurt that I tried to kind of create a heat map for to show you where some of their clients were. So again, it shows that it spreads all the way over to Ukraine from a bank that's based in Frankfurt. Austria is going to get so angry at the United States that it's going to ban the sale of US bonds in Austria. And the reason for that is people are ditching Austrian bonds and purchasing US bonds. So other kind of metrics that we can kind of look at in terms of how well they're selling. US bonds are the only bonds in places like Berlin and Munich. With the stock market at this time, they would have midday quotations, kind of a noonday quote, right? Don't think the ticker kind of constantly changing. They would have noon quotations that they would publish, and US bonds are the only bonds in places like Berlin that aren't a German bond. Sometimes they would have Austrian bonds with midday quotations. The only other ones, it's not British bonds, right? It's not British consols, it's US debt. So it goes to show you that there's kind of a very vibrant and active market for these. And they're used as a recruitment tool, lastly, to encourage people to come to America, that future immigrants should buy these bonds. One letter said that these bonds are the most powerful and influential emissaries you could have sent over to the old continent to convert the masses in Republican principles. So, and this is a German citizen writing this. This is an American who lives in Frankfurt who is writing that. So one last kind of global map here that you can see by 1870, bond sales, where are these bonds actually being sold across the globe? It's quite remarkable. US bonds, they have to write them in different languages. So the Japanese request bonds with Japanese script so that they can sell them more efficiently in places like Japan. And you can see that it really kind of tracks all over the globe. $30 million in Cuba that I was able to find through a New York bank. Several archbishops in South Africa, right? The stories go on, but it becomes a truly kind of global story. So these bond drives are really interesting because they certainly gave Americans, and I would argue the masses, an opportunity to buy into the cause of the Union and their country, and I'd even argue themselves. But it also opens a new chapter for American financial history. It's a chapter in which, yes, the masses are buying them, but it's also extending the sale of these bonds to a global market, really for the first time ever. And just kind of to come full circle here, this is a newspaper from World War I, and it's actually referencing the bond sales from the Civil War. And it's talking about how we can actually try to sell these bonds to the masses. Jay Cooke's grandson is actually going to lead bond operations kind of in an honorary capacity in the city of Philadelphia. But for all of that association we have with World Wars I and II being these mass democratic kind of bond events for war bonds, I think it's really important for us to look back into the 19th century, to look at people like Jay Cooke, to look at the people behind these bonds, and realize that it's an informative way to look at the war, and that the war still has things to tell us. So thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. If anyone does have questions, we have these two mics. Please come up and ask your questions at the mic so that our audiences who are watching remotely can hear. Yeah.
I thought this was very interesting, and I want to thank Julie for inviting me today. I didn't know about it, so thank you, Julie. I'm interested to know if you found any insurance companies or pension funds that own these bonds.
Yes. So the short answer is loads of insurance companies. I mean, the lists are never ending. So lots and lots of insurance companies. In terms of pension funds, nothing's jumping out at me offhand, but insurance companies, yes, left and right. I mean, it's funny. I got a chuckle. I saw my own healthcare insurance provider listed. I was like, oh, all right. Well, there it is. I feel like if I told them, they probably wouldn't care, and it wouldn't affect my premium or anything like that. But yeah, insurance companies left and right, absolutely.
I was interested in how these bonds work. If you sell all these bonds, how did the United States government pay the interest? And when do they collect interest? Every 6 months, 4 months?
Yeah, so in terms of the interest question, interest was twice a year. So it was every 6 months. So it was May and November that the interest payout occurred, and there'd be all announcements in the paper if you wanted to do it. I often get a question about counterfeit bonds. And the reality is that there aren't that many. The bonds are actually really hard to counterfeit during the war. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. The US government is going to break up an operation in Ireland where they're making them. And they're trying to ship them to France, and they stopped the boat off the coast of France because they were going to ship them from France to make it look like the French did it, to try to there was, 3 layers of kind of chess going on there in this dynamic. But that's how the interest payments are being made. In terms of, I'm sorry, now I'm blanking on the other part of the question. So there was the interest payment, but also just how did they do it? How do they pay them off? So ultimately they're going to refinance these bonds again and again and again to lower interest rates. But the federal government at this time, that we do create an income tax during the Civil War. It's the first income tax. I always like to point out that the city of New Orleans falls in April of 1862. Within 11 days of the fall of New Orleans to Union forces, they are collecting federal income tax from the residents of New Orleans. So quite efficient. But Western land sales still are going to raise quite a bit of money. So oftentimes I also get asked, when do they finally pay off the Civil War debt? And it's a hard question. You can't say on this particular date because they refinance them so many times, but presumably it's safe bet would be by the early 1890s that we think that the Civil War debt is actually paid off. Yes, sir.
You might have mentioned this because I came in late. What about Confederate bond sales?
Absolutely. I keep this here because I'm going to forget the numbers, and that's why I put it on page 1 for whenever someone asks this question. So Confederate bonds are not the same in the sense of the federal government, about 75% of the war for them is going to be financed through bond sales. For the Confederacy, it's only about 1/3. 1/3 of the war is going to be financed through bonds. About 60% of it is just them printing money, right? So Confederate inflation's fairly notorious by the end of the war. And frankly, not even the end of the war, by the midpoint of the war. And only about 10% of the war is going to be covered by the Confederacy through things like taxation, because when you're starting a secession movement and you don't want to have a large central authority, most people aren't really on board with creating an income tax within the Confederacy. So they're mostly just going to print money. Most of the records on the financial side for the Confederacy burn when they evacuate Richmond in April of 1865. So we have a little bit of speculation there. It's informed speculation, but it's still a little bit of speculation. But we know for a fact that bonds just weren't sold nearly as much. And unlike these U.S. bonds, you can buy a Confederate bond still today, on eBay if you want. They're out there. They exist.
Here in Kentucky, the largest bank at the time was the Northern Bank, and it was headquartered in Lexington, had branches in Louisville, Glasgow, and some other towns. And it had union ties. Would Cooke have used a bank like that as a conduit to sell bonds? And would that bank have gotten a commission on the sales?
So yes and yes. And I have Lexington slides as well, kind of photos. So I bet the Northern Bank's on there. I'm happy to send them along. I bet they're on there. Cooke creates a network. He's very deliberate about this. So he's got these traveling agents, but he's also cognizant of the fact that in larger towns, but also cities, banks are the trusted institution. And so you find one, and congratulations, you're the exclusive agent, right? New York City is an exception, right? He's going to use a few banks. And then there are some people who actively dislike Cooke. And so they don't want to have anything to do with him. But he's going to find banks, friendly banks is often what he referred to them as in his correspondence, to be his agents. And he would create special arrangements with them. It usually didn't mean a different commission, but Cooke had some weird connection to Ohio wine. So he would send free crates of Ohio wine to people. And that's how he kind of sweetened the deal for some of these banks. He couldn't change the terms of the commission, but he could ply them with some fine Ohio wine.
I wanted to circle back perhaps a bit to Confederate territory, if not the Confederacy proper, but then also you mentioned Missouri and border state conditions. I remember a long time ago when you were conducting this research, we had a really fantastic conversation about why it would be important beyond financial incentives for people in Confederate territory to purchase these bonds as evidence of commitment to the Union cause. I wonder if you could expand on what utility does that serve for people?
Absolutely. A great comment and question and a recollection of a conversation we had at some point. New Orleans is a great example of that. New Orleans is a city where if you actually look at some of these individuals who are purchasing the bonds, it's quite obvious what they're trying to do, the calculus here. One of them is a grocer, right? If you want to get the war contract for the Union Army in New Orleans, right, you want to demonstrate fidelity and loyalty, right? There's lots of different ways you can do it, of course, and you can claim that you were always for the Union and maybe somebody can back you up, but purchasing that debt can't hurt. It's a way certainly also to secure some of your money at a time when you probably don't want to have it just kind of kicking around. You can get it in these bonds and it's documented. And I know for a fact that on multiple occasions that for some of these individuals, you're actually going to see it pay off, right? And is that the reason why they become, a contractor for the Union Army? Maybe, I don't know for sure, but I think it certainly was a calculated guess in some instances.
Well, I believe that wraps up our time for Q&A. I would like to invite everyone to head over to the book table and pick up a copy of Bonds of War, continue this conversation as we have our author sign it. And then for those of us adjourning down to Bucks for dinner, enjoy that conversation too. Can we get another round of applause though?